Welcome to the Start Here podcast for web development. I'm Keith Monahan.
And I'm Dane Miller.
And we're here to show you how to build a career in web development. You can find us online at starthere.fm. Hi Dane, how's it going?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
Doing well. Busy last week or two. How about you?
Yeah, really busy as well. We're launching a new application for the company I work for on November 4th, so we're in crunch time.
Man, that's coming up here. That's pretty soon.
Yep. So It's been a crazy week. But I'm excited to talk about Ruby on Rails.
Yeah, so this is kind of your this is what you've been using quite a lot since you started, right?
The thing about Ruby on Rails for me is that I would pretty much state that my career took off because of Ruby on Rails.
Oh, because you chose that to kind of start with?
Right. I chose that to start with simply because it was the easiest. And a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about today, the common theme is, developer productivity, speed of development and such. And I feel like I could have never achieved the type of client work that I did so quickly, like month 2, month 3 of me learning Rails, or even like month 1, if it weren't for Rails's ease of use, right? And the speed of development. So all these common themes today that we're going to be talking about are really integral, I feel like, to my life and in general, and my career especially.
Mm-hmm. Cool. That's exciting. So let's dive right in. When we're talking about Ruby on Rails, Ruby is a language. It's a programming language, and Rails is the framework. It's built on top of Rails. Real quick, just an overview about Ruby as a language itself. Can you give us kind of a background, maybe how long it's been around? Do people use Ruby for anything else besides the web?
Sure. So basically, Ruby was conceived by a gentleman named Yukiro Matsumoto, and I'm not really sure how to pronounce his first name, but I believe the last name is Matsumoto. That's how you pronounce that. And it was conceived around February 1993. And obviously the integration with Rails wasn't conceived until 2004, 2005. So there was a large period there. And I really love the name Ruby to start off with. And I think that was one of the benefits of this language. Just the name itself, almost emphasizes the simplicity of the language. And that was a core tenet that Matsumoto had when he was creating this language. It was minimalism, developer productivity and efficiency, and it just so happens that Rails also carries that on, which is why you get this exponential productivity factor. And so the simplicity and the ease of use were really integral to his design of the language. And he mentions that Perl was some sort of a baseline that he used when he was developing, and some other languages as well. This was sort of the time when a lot of people were creating new languages. So it makes sense that Ruby was conceived around this time. And I actually don't know of any use cases for Ruby from 1993 until Rails was invented around
like outside the web.
Right. In between that time frame of 1995 to 2004, when David Heinemeier Hansson extracted Rails from Basecamp, I'm not really sure what it was used for, but I know that there was some people using it for custom web stuff. There was some people writing scripts with it. Very similar life to Python in that way. Okay. Python obviously has gained a lot more traction in academia and scripting in general, but Ruby also during that early time was used for a lot of scripting as well.
Interesting. Okay. Is there anything that sets Ruby apart from other languages? I mean, you mentioned some of the ideas, the core tenets of simplicity and like programmer productivity. Is that kind of it, or are there other ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think the simplicity is the big one. So if you watch Matsumoto give talks or conversations on this topic, he always mentions how minimalism is like a huge tenet to him and how it was really important building Ruby. And I should mention that Ruby 1.0 didn't come out until 1996. So it was conceived, early in the 90s. 1.0 obviously didn't come out until later in the 90s, similar to Node. Node.js was in the 0 version numbers for a long, long time. Yeah, so it had a very similar life cycle to that in a way. But Ruby emphasizes simplicity and developer productivity. So, and I mentioned that before, but I'll just say it again, that I think the way that you use Ruby as opposed to other languages is very different. So an example might be just common things that you do in development, like iteration or, various types of looping, various filtering techniques, various sorting techniques, all these different types of things that in other languages might be more cumbersome or syntax heavy to write, even calling functions, defining functions, passing around parameters. All of this stuff that you do in a language, in Ruby, Matsumoto tried to make it as simple as possible, and he tried to use as little syntax as possible.
Ooh, I like that.
Right. So with C++ and in other languages, if you're a Ruby developer and you go to Objective-C, you will be like almost amazed at how many brackets there are, right? It's like there's languages where it almost seemed like they were trying to go for as much syntax as possible. Whereas Ruby was the complete opposite. And that's one of the core tenets that I feel like the community has really enjoyed over the course of its run.
Okay, cool. So that's Ruby. And then we want to talk about Rails as well. And so Rails, commonly known as Ruby on Rails. What is the proliferation of Rails, right? How many companies use it in comparison to other frameworks, and where does it sit within the, server-side framework world?
So, I should just back up and say Ruby on Rails started by, obviously, David Heinemeier Hansen, who is a partner at 37 Signals, now called Basecamp. And he developed Ruby on Rails as a framework for Ruby when he was building Basecamp as a contractor for Jason Fried at 37 Signals. And he was actually in Denmark and was working remotely and was building this framework. And then after a certain period of time, he realized that the community would really enjoy this, or he thought. And so he open sourced it, I believe in 2004, 2005. I think the first commit rights were given in 2005. And from there on, it really has prolificated a lot in the startup communities. And I think we'll talk about that in a minute. But really, that's sort of the genesis of Rails as it stands.
Okay. What do you know about as far as how it's used in production compared to other frameworks?
The consensus really is, I feel like in the community, is that Ruby on Rails will probably never be as big as PHP. And that's okay. And I feel like everybody in the community understands that, and everybody's okay with that. It's not trying to be as big as those communities. You can think of it a lot like Apple in a way. And I know this is a really bizarre analogy perhaps, but I view PHP and PHP frameworks almost like Windows. And I view Ruby on Rails a lot like Apple. So they both have different philosophies. They both have different frameworks, and one has a lot more use than the other, right? So Windows is still probably 90+% of the computers on the planet, whereas Apple is very small, but very powerful. And a lot of creation and a lot of media creation especially happens in an Apple environment. And that is exactly I think that's a great juxtapose to Ruby on Rails and PHP. So obviously PHP is used a lot more popular. ASP.NET is very popular as well. Java is very popular. These are all very popular frameworks that are very dominant in the world of programming, especially on the web. But Ruby on Rails you can think of as like a strike team. So a lot of startups will use Ruby on Rails because you can develop quickly, you can develop fast, you can get MVPs out the door very rapidly. And
okay, well, let's talk about that for just a second,
sure,
right?
Yeah.
Because when I've done some comparison research about Rails and some other backend frameworks that may be on PHP or JavaScript, the thing I keep hearing about Rails is this idea of convention over configuration. And that's kind of what you're getting at, right? I mean, that's what's enabling these startups to put out a product so quickly. What does that mean? What is convention over configuration?
Right. So that's exactly right. That is kind of the overarching theme that I'm getting at with that answer, is that due to the way Rails provides you all the conventions you need without having to configure anything, you can get things done much faster, much more quickly. Specifically, what convention over configuration means is that you don't have to configure a lot. It all comes by convention in the framework. So if you just follow the conventions, which are the standards, the best practices, etc., you will be able to get an application up and running very, very quickly. And what is also really, really great about that is that all the deployment clouds that integrate with Ruby on Rails all understand those conventions. And because you utilize those conventions and they utilize those conventions, deploying a Rails app is literally like one keystroke. Right? One key command. And versus PHP or Python, perhaps you can make it more complicated. Obviously, Rails usually is more complicated, but at its simplest, most basic level, it is very easy to work with because everybody that follows these conventions is all on the same page. So the whole community is on the same page in a sense because of that. And it allows for great proliferation of question and answering. Stack Overflow is just, excuse the pun, but literally overflowing with answers to Ruby questions because people always have the same questions. And it's almost like they could figure it out themselves, but based on the convention, the community is here to just tell you the right way to do it.
Okay, cool. So there's kind of a prescription. Right.
And you could probably tell me with PHP, it seems as though I haven't been a PHP developer for probably like many years, 5+ years. And it seems to me as though when you set up a new PHP app, you can configure it in any number of ways, and perhaps there's no one best way to do it.
For sure. I would say that's a fair description compared to Rails when you're developing an application. And that's the great thing about PHP is it's so flexible, but I don't know. I mean, it's very appealing, what you're talking about with Rails, how there's kind of a prescribed way to do things. And if you follow that pattern, then you get to have the benefits of all of these productivity hacks kind of.
Yeah. And it's, again, I really love the analogy of the way Apple does things to the way Rails does things, because the Apple concept of having software and hardware built by the same company it results in the same type of user experience that happens as a developer working with Rails, because you're using the conventions that both the deployment vehicle as well as your local host all understand the same conventions. So it's all the same. Everybody's on the same page again. And I think that's the most important. That's
pretty cool. So when did people start using Rails? When did it come onto the scene?
Rails really, as I mentioned, I think a minute ago, it came onto the scene in 2004, 2005 when he originally abstracted it from Basecamp. But I think what you're getting at is when did it really become popular? And it didn't really become popular until roughly 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009. These are all years where you see a hockey-like stick curve going up into the right with Rails adoption. And again, Rails isn't as popular as PHP, but it was really embraced by the startup community. A lot of the proliferation of Rails came from Eric Ries, who was the author of The Lean Startup and really went around prophesizing about this lean startup mentality and how to build quickly and iterate rapidly and develop and with speed and all these things. And he really was a huge proponent of Rails, and that also helped, I think.
So Eric Ries talked about the minimum viable product, right? Being able to get something out the door quickly. And I guess so Rails excels at that, right? If you're following convention. Okay.
I think so.
Are there specific things that Rails does really well compared to other frameworks and things that it doesn't do very well?
Again, Rails is really great for startups or anybody that wants a minimum, for instance, for me, I do a lot of freelance work and I focus on management-based applications for clients that need, and especially clients that need them done within 2 weeks. So that is very much a job description for Rails. So anything that you need that has data entry involved, perhaps some sort of form collection of data, etc., a basic web app that you would write on the web, pretty much anything like that is perfect for Rails. So, and I've used it a lot for that sort of thing, but you'll see it used constantly in more complex applications. Twitter was first started in Rails. Tons of sites are first started in Rails, and then they move on to other frameworks as their complexity grows. One thing that's really interesting about Rails is a lot of people are interested, or in the past few years have been interested in how it doesn't scale. Now, we all saw Twitter run Rails, and we all saw Twitter fail with the fail whale over and over again, and people started to blame Rails, and there was this big notoriety that Rails can't scale, and then David Heinemeier Hansson went around preaching that Rails can scale, and it was this whole big thing. Now, what we've all come to, I think, is the understanding that it doesn't matter if it's Rails or Java or ASP or whatever. It all just matters how you use it, right? And how you build the server-side infrastructure. And so what a lot of people are doing nowadays is they'll have Rails on the server, and then they'll have like the Rails serve an API, So the Rails will serve JSON. And let's say that you have like some really complex like chat feature or some really crazy data mining that you need to do in between the JSON from the database and the client. What they'll do is they'll build services. So Twitter is famous for this. They'll build like a service using a language such as Haskell or something crazy specifically tailored for that service. And then they'll do all the data crunching and business logic inside that service and then send it on to the client, which ingests that data that has perhaps been JSON from the server on Rails, then to the service and something else, and then JSON out to the client. Then the client is obviously using some kind of backbone or thick client framework that ingests that data and then displays it. And that's pretty much the typical stack. So you have like the Rails server, some kind of services in the middle if needed. Oftentimes you don't. And then the client usually utilizing some kind of JSON parsing front end framework to display the content. And with that sort of a paradigm, I really don't think you'll have any problems scaling Rails, that plus an infrastructure that is solid. So that whole, what does Rails not do very well? Well, it doesn't scale. That's not really a valid or legitimate point of view. And I just wanted to get that across.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, interesting. And you kind of touched on some of what I was going to ask for my next question here is, what other technologies are typically used with Rails? Like, are there popular or favorite like templating engines and like, I don't know if we've ever talked about package managers, but maybe what are those and like, how does that work?
Sure. I'll start at package managers and go backwards. So package managers on Rails, the packages are called gems. And they're basically there's another convention over configuration sort of situation here. So there's a convention for the way that you build and open source and write your gems. And then there's a place that you put them, like Ruby gems. And it's a hosted environment. So the Ruby gems points to a GitHub repo or something. And then basically when you go to include a Ruby gem in your project, you type in gem space, the name of the gem. And then when you bundle install, which means like update the code for the gems, it will pull the latest version from rubygems.org. Rubygems.org will go to GitHub and verify that that version is linked and everything is good. And then that version is what actually gets deployed into your project. So you can actually lock down gems on a version basis, which is really useful. So you don't have versions changing all out of whack.
Okay.
There's a more complex contract there. There's a contract between the gem developer and you that the gem developer probably won't break any popular Rails versions. Again, it's nice to have the small amount of detail to be able to lock down gems to versions.
Okay, cool. And so a package is basically just trying to add maybe like functionality to your app?
Yeah, so a package in most languages is a common set of functionality or a component that is global or can be utilized by more than one application. So for instance, datetime is a Ruby standard library because it's so standard that everybody is going to need it at some point. So that makes sense. But let's say you want to do datetime manipulation in UTC or from PST to UTC, and then you want to put some superset functions on top of that like do some specific type of manipulation, but you still think it's useful to the community, then you would make that a gem. You know, you would put that gem up on Ruby gems and put it on GitHub, and then other people could install that gem and then utilize those methods, those public methods that you've given them, which is really nice. And a lot of people have a lot of great gems that increase the productivity of developers quite a lot, especially when it comes to testing and doing fake data. The community is really crazy, and that's why I also recommend Ruby on Rails to newcomers. Because the community is so vast, it not only helps answering questions, and it does, and there's great tutorials because of that, etc. But also there's gems for everything, right? So because the community is so vast, the gems are so vast, and there's so many choices, and almost, building a Ruby on Rails app is almost like being a construction site manager. You're basically just putting blocks together. Like this gem for this gem for this, and this is the standard gem for user verification, and this is the standard gem for user authentication, and you put all these blocks together, and then you build your complicated set of abstractions on top of that, or you know what I mean? So that's one thing about the community that I really like as well. And then to answer your first question, that what technologies are really common with Rails, it actually varies quite a bit. I mean, you won't see everybody in Rails using one thing, just like in Node or PHP, you won't see that, but you'll see a common set. So for JavaScript, you'll usually see Angular, Ember, and Backbone, which is no surprise. Those are the biggest. Ember was actually built by Yehuda Katz, who was a Rails core member, recently retired, but for many, many years, I think plus 10 years or 7 years at least. And his framework is really optimized for Rails. And actually Backbone is as well. And Angular, I can't really say too much about that, but they all work with Rails really, really well. And you'll see them used quite literally almost every time somebody builds a Rails app that's in production. Now, okay. Other technologies that you'll see used as well, Rails provides, or the community has provided gems for almost every major library for CSS. So things like Compass, obviously the CSS in Rails, Rails comes with Sass by default. So it's a CSS superset that you can do more advanced CSS manipulation on. So a preprocessor. And the community provides great support for things like Compass and Bourbon and pretty much like Bootstrap, Foundation, all these types of CSS libraries and frameworks and fun stuff. They've all been provided as gems, so it's super easy to get a Rails app up and running with your favorite Sass modification or less superset or whatever you want, and then also to add your JavaScript framework. It's all super easy, and then all you need to do is make sure that your server returns JSON, which by default the Rails server will return HTML. So if you're using like Rails scaffolding, so that's one thing that I think Rails could improve upon in the future is by default return JSON. But that's just something to keep in mind.
Okay. So you touched on my next question here a little bit. Wanted to ask about the community. What is your perception of the Rails community? And you've definitely talked about this a bit, but maybe more specifics. And are there some different communities, and how is that experience compared to maybe other frameworks or other language communities that you've gotten some experience with?
I would say the Rails community is my favorite programming language community out there. To think about like the Rails community, you really need to think about where the community exists at. And then you have another step where you can abstract that and think about the community as a whole. So first, let's think about where the communities exist at. So there's a Rails community on Stack Overflow. There's Rails communities in forums. There's Rails communities in tutorial sites that have comments with really nice people asking questions and answers like Railscasts and so on and so forth. And people gather and communicate in IRC. And the IRC for Ruby on Rails has been notoriously incredibly popular, along with Nodejs and so on and so forth. So there's all these types of different places that you can go to get into the community, but there's a couple overarching themes that you'll find everywhere you go. And one of those is helpfulness. Everybody that I've run into in the Rails community is super, super helpful. And as a quote unquote newbie starting out in a language or some kind of place, you usually want to seem as though you're not a newbie so as to be accepted by the like Jedis of the community. But Ruby on Rails, I mean, it's a little bit like that in a way, but it's less like that, I think, than other languages that I found. And Node.js is a little bit like that as well. Okay. Another one of the overarching themes I would say is that you will find answers to questions on pretty much anything. So if you have a very, very specific question, you can find an answer for it because here's why. The Rails community is pretty much the only community around Ruby that I know of. I'll give you an example. If I have a PHP question and I go to ask it, if it's a little bit of a general question, maybe the first response is going to be, hey, what framework are you using? Is this a CodeIgniter question, a Laravel question? Is this a etc. question? But with Rails, if you're asking a question about Ruby or how it integrates with something, everybody is just going to assume that you're using Rails. And because of that, you get a lot of prior knowledge, prior art that is developed in these communities and people asking questions on things that you're going to run into. Like if you just Google, for instance, how to build a chat application on Ruby on Rails, I've never searched that, but I can guarantee you there's going to be like 5 tutorials on that, or at least 2 or 3. And the reason is it's all the same. It's just one framework, one language, whereas PHP is one language and like 10 frameworks. And all of this ties back together with Ruby being super helpful. So because of all that, it's just a really great place for beginners and just people that are trying to learn to code, because of all that.
You've painted Rails in a really good light. I kind of want to get in and do some exploring with that. That's fun.
And I should say, so all my opinions on Rails, I should say, are highly biased because I love Rails and I hate PHP and I'm indeterminate on Python. And, so I'm one of those like, quote unquote, like Apple apologists, but for Rails. So I love Rails and I will always proliferate Rails as much as I can because I really believe it has all these benefits that I'm saying. And yes, other languages could have some of these benefits. And yeah, the community in Python is really okay. And yes, Node.js is getting to be very popular and the community is very cutting edge. And I understand all that. But the Rails community has just been around for so long, and the Node.js community is a little bit like run and gun Wild West, whereas the Rails community is a little bit more mature. I would say quite a bit more mature. It's used in more production apps. It's been around for longer. People have had to deal with it in scale for longer. The questions are much more detailed, and the answers are much more detailed because of that. So you have these people like the infrastructure engineers at Twitter who have had to deal with Rails scaling. If you rewind the tape back 2 years ago, you probably never would have met anybody that had to deal with Node.js scaling, or maybe 3 years ago. But you still would have been at a time where you had people that had dealt with Rails scaling. So we're just in this interesting time where Rails is at a great time to get in. And if you really want to be on the cutting edge, I would recommend Node.js. But again, you're not going to find that same type of clarification that you do in the Rails community.
What is the single best resource for learning Ruby on Rails?
Sure. So the best resource that everybody goes through when they're just starting Rails, pretty much no matter what, is the Ruby on Rails book, which is railstutorial.org/book. And there's some paid products as well. I think he offers like a paid book or something. There's some kind of paid monetary thing that he does to try and make money. But Michael Hartle has made this book for many, many, many years. And I first got into it like 5 years ago when I was starting, and it's still around and it's updated every single time Rails is updated. And he will basically walk you through step by step from the beginning to the end how to create a Twitter clone. I believe he also teaches you how to create a blog. That has been a really beneficial thing for pretty much everybody I know. Now, once you move beyond that, then you get into the land of, okay, I need assistance on a project by project basis. If you know the basics and say you have a client project and you need assistance on how to build user authentication, then most people are going to turn to Railscasts. Now, Railscasts it's railscast.org. Now, Railscasts have been around for many, many years and have been invaluable to pretty much everybody in the community. It's created by a guy named Ryan Bates, who is an absolute genius from my point of view, but also he's really good at teaching, and he's really a great screencaster. He explains things really well, and they're really easy to understand. Unfortunately, Railscast has been on a hiatus since, I believe, September of last year, or somewhere around that. He's been gone for a long, long time, and there's a banner on his site, if you go there, about when he's going to be back. The reason I'm explaining that to you is, as a user, all his episodes are going to be outdated. So he still will teach you the basics, but a lot of his stuff is going to be outdated because it's over a year old. There's a couple other communities that are popping up, and we'll include links in the show notes to various Railscasts communities where people are doing screencasts for Rails development now and not a year ago. Although we all love Ryan Bates and everybody is respectful of him, I will say that it is a little bit of an old, out-of-date resource now, which is super, super unfortunate because I love that guy and I love his teaching style and I would love to recommend this. And I will still recommend that you check it out and watch the videos just for education. Again, it's a little out of date.
I guess so. Jumping back just a second, getting back into the framework and kind of how it's used, how is it used locally? So people are going to work on their local computers, and what does that mean to do that? Because like in Windows, you might set up a server, but what does that mean for Rails?
So Rails started becoming bundled with Mac in 10.5.
Oh, wow.
And basically, I believe Mac still bundles Rails version 1.8.5 or 1.8.7, and it has for many years now. So basically, what that means is you can open up your brand new Mac computer without installing anything, go to the terminal and type Rails new and then the application name, and then it will bundle install and create the application folders. Then you cd into the directory and then you type Rails server, and then you're done. You basically have a localhost setup running that you can then go to localhost 3000 in your browser and see it.
That is so easy.
Mac might include an old version of Rails, but Mac does provide Ruby. So upgrading Ruby is a little bit more difficult. You have to install, usually you will install a Ruby version manager, which is a management application to install different versions so that you can switch them back and forth. And then based on that, once you enter into a version of Ruby, then you'll install Rails. Very easy. You just type gem install Rails. Gems are something that Bundler creates, and Bundler, I believe, is installed by default on every Mac. I haven't had a brand new Mac in a while, so I'm not super familiar with what comes by default, but basically the workflow is, in a directory, once you have Rails installed and the Ruby version that you want, basically you'll just type Ruby new project name and then cd into the directory after it's run, and then you just type Rails server. And then basically it starts up the server and you're good to go. So basically that's the simplicity of starting a localhost development in Rails. Then you obviously modify the code and restart the server if you need to and start building your application from there.
Okay, yeah, so that's definitely different than what I have to do on Windows. That's pretty incredible that you have a server ready to go from the get-go with your Mac computer.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of people love it because of that.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, that helps me understand why a lot of developers who use Ruby are diehard Mac fans, right? So it integrates really well. Well, and so if you were to develop an app on your computer, you've got it all finished, all polished and ready to go. What is deployment like? How do you get, and we've talked a little bit about this, but specifically with Ruby on Rails, what's it like to deploy an application?
So we talked about this in another episode, how deployment is usually a process of copying files from a local environment to a production environment. And that's pretty much the gist of it, right? So you copy files from local to production environments, usually from your local host computer to a server, and then you'll switch things. So you'll switch the database from the development one to the production one, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, with PHP, that might be a complicated process, and I'm not so sure about that, but with Rails, it's super easy because of the conventions. So basically what that means is, all of these deployment clouds, such as AppFog, Heroku, EngineYard, all of these companies that build these deployment clouds that ingest Rails apps, they all understand these conventions. And because of that, they've made it super easy and provided you APIs so that you can deploy in one line. So literally, the current app that I'm working on is hosted on Heroku, and Heroku is famously very, very simple to deploy to. So I'll have my application in my terminal. I'll have the server running. Maybe I'm done developing. I'll close the server. I'll Command C or Control C or whatever to exit out of the server. Then I'll simply type git push, push all the assets up to Git. And then once that's done, I'll just do git push Heroku master. And basically Heroku has a hook into Git. So you could basically, you basically push, Heroku has an API, so you push to Heroku, and then it knows what to pull from GitHub, and then what branch to push that to on Heroku. So there's some common paradigms there, and AppFog and EngineYard have their own paradigms as well, but they're all very similar, right? So they'll all usually ingest from GitHub to their app on some sort of branching scheme. So
it's pretty simple to go from your local environment and deploy it somewhere and then get it on the server.
Yep.
Right. Okay. Awesome. That's pretty cool. I think that was a good overview. So if our listeners have more questions about Rails, we would love to answer those. Well, probably Dane more specifically. And so let us know. If you've got questions, you can find this show and the show notes on our website at starthere.fm/webdev/9.
And I'm at dane@starthere.fm. You can email me, as Keith said, with any questions, anything at all. We'd be happy to hear from you.
Absolutely. So thanks for stopping by today. We will catch up with you next time.
Bye.
Bye.